So today we're going to be doing a full build from scratch using the Dilly frame, just so you guys can kind of see how a build with the frame goes together. It's not going to be a super in-depth video. I'm not going to really go through all the minutia and everything just because it would take so long, but I do want to kind of give some pointers for if you're going to be building with this frame, just kind of showing how it'll go together. So I guess the first and most important thing is going to be the component choice. So of course, at the center of everything is the Dilly frame. I'm going to be using the 6-inch version today. Next up, the flight controller. This is a CLRacing F4S. This happens to be a V1.6, but older versions are fine too. It's a 30x30 flight controller. It's AIO, so it has dedicated power pads for the individual ESCs that we're going to be using, speaking of which, are the GS35s. These are a super solid individual ESC. I've been using them for well over a year now on pretty much all my builds. They run BLHeli32, so beware that the only way you can access the settings for BLHeli32 ESC are through the BLHeli32 configurator, which is only available for Windows. So if you don't have a Windows PC at all, you may want to stray away from BLHeli32s, just because it's nice to get in there and program your settings. So the next thing will be the motors. These are 2208 2400 kVs from Brother Hobby. They are the custom Buffalo motor. They're a top spec motor. They're super nice. Like I said, they're 2208s. Typically for 4S, I would use the 2700 kV version, but today I'm going to be using the 2400 kV version. That gives a little more versatility. You can put these on 5S, and it's a rocket, or you can put them on 4S and it'll be a little more efficient. For the receiver, it's going to be a Crossfire NanoRx. It's pretty much the best receiver you can buy. You know, not the cheapest receiver, but if you want a really solid link, this one, or they also have a diversity one where you can attach 2 antennas. I haven't personally used that one, but I hear it's fantastic for longer range stuff. The camera is a Runcam Micro Eagle. This is the JB version. Definitely all around my favorite camera. Super good picture quality. Camera control pins right there, so you can adjust the settings from Betaflight. And yeah, good low light performance. Everything just really good about this camera. For the video transmitter, we're going to be using a Tramp HV from ImmersionRC. I love this VTX specifically for the tag that comes with it. It's an amazing feature that will allow you to program the band, channel, and power of your video transmitter even when your quad is turned off. So if you're getting to a spot and there's people flying already, you can just kind of say, like, what channel do I need to be on? You touch your phone to the tag, and then it's there before you even plug in. So there's no worrying about, you know, knocking anyone's video out or anything like that. You know, it's super simple and straightforward. And then lastly, for the video antenna, I'm just going to be using an old Lumenier Axii 5.8 right-hand circular polarized. Really solid antenna overall. I'm sure the V2s are fantastic as well, but for now we're just using that one because I had it on hand already. So, a couple of other things that I'm going to be using throughout the course of this video. First of all, this double-sided sticky foam adhesive, this 3M stuff. You can pick this up at Walmart or anywhere. Use that for mounting various components directly to the carbon fiber. It's useful for a bunch of stuff, actually. Some heat shrink. I have purple here. This is going to be for the ESCs, video transmitter, a whole bunch of stuff. I also have this PVC heat shrink. This is, so the difference between this is kind of a softer material, it's thicker, and this is thinner, but it's stiff when it's shrunk. So it kind of gives components like a hard outer shell, whereas this one's a little softer. Yeah, zip ties, of course you need zip ties, because how could you not have zip ties? Pair of tweezers, something like this, is going to be great for holding wires as you solder them. There's going to be a little bit of a fine soldering going on here, so it helps to have something to grab the wires while you have the iron in your hand. Wire for the XT60, and of course, actual XT60 connector. I'm really starting to prefer these ones that come with this backing as well. It kind of looks like this when you're done. You don't have to mess with any heat shrink. It's just a really easy, clean way to do it. So I like those. Conformal coating. Typically you hear about this when people are talking about waterproofing, but I like to do it to pretty much every quad, just because it helps even if you're somewhere where it's like a little damp, where it was raining the day before or something and the grass is a little wet. It just gives your quad a nice robustness, I guess you would say, where you're not worrying about shorting out components all the time, even if it's just a little wet. This is a 1000 microfarad capacitor, 35 volt. This is going to go directly onto the LiPo lead, and it cleans up the electrical signal. You don't have to use one of these, but I definitely recommend using one of these. It'll clean up your video, it'll clean up the signal going to your ESCs. It just makes for an overall electrically cleaner environment for your build. Blue Loctite, super essential. Make sure it's not the red stuff, because you can see this right here says removable. The red stuff is not removable, so if you use the red, you cinch your screw down and it dries, you're gonna have a real hard time trying to get that thing out again. So always use blue. I have this here because the GS35s come with the signal wires like a PVC wire, and I always prefer silicone wiring for everything. It's just it's way more reliable. It doesn't like shrivel up as you try to solder to it. It's just easier to work with overall, and provides for a more solid build. So I'm going to swap that out with this nice silicone wire. And stack hardware is another thing you're going to need. So I have M3 nuts right there. These are M3 spacers. I think they're 4 or 5 mil spacers. And then I definitely recommend having something like a hardware kit, where this is not the default hardware that comes with something like this, but an assorted M3 bolt kit is really great to have around, just because if you need some weird screw for your standoff, you know, you're pretty sure you're gonna have it. So I'm just gonna snag a couple of these out of here right now. And then this little thing I like to have as well, this is like one of those stack cover plate things that's just been chopped in half down the center. And this is really good for mounting a NanoRx on the top of here. So I like to mount my NanoRxs on something like this to give it space from other components. I don't really want it on top of the flight controller or underneath the flight controller or directly on top of something else. So I use this to put it up on the stack, give it a little space. You'll see how it goes into the build. I think it just provides for like a really clean, nice way to mount that. So wire cutters obviously are going to be important to have. Pretty much all the wires that we're going to be dealing with need to be cut to length, so usually people have wire cutters laying around, but make sure you got a pair handy. And then, of course, a good roll of solder and a soldering iron. So I use a 60-40. I hear 63-37 is better. Just make sure that you're not trying to use unleaded solder. It's terrible to work with. And actually the lead in here doesn't even burn up. Actually, what you see when you see solder fumes is the rosin core burning out. So the lead never gets vaporized. You're not breathing in lead. Still recommend using like a fan or something, just so that you're not breathing in the vaporized rosin core, because that's probably not great either. But yeah, leaded solder is so easy to work with, and like I said, 60-40 or 63-37 are just going to make your life so much easier when you're building something, especially like this when you're going to be doing a bunch of soldering. So, yeah. Alright, so I think that's about enough of me talking. Let's get into it. So, of course, you're going to want to start with the frame. Like I said, this is a Dilly 6-inch. So, of course, when you open it up, you're going to get all the carbon that you need to put the thing together. So, bottom plate, top plate, brace plate, and 4 arms. You're also going to get these arm protectors. So these just slide over the ends of your arms like this, and then they will seriously prolong the life of the end of your arms, just because DAAANG is going to happen no matter what. Whenever you crash, this is going to be the first thing that hits. So these really help just to, you know, slow down the DAAANG process, and they don't add too much weight. So I like to put those on. Feel free to leave them off if you want. We get the hardware kit. So, comes with a sticker. And then inside the hardware kit is also going to be the 3D printed FPV camera mounts. So we'll save those for later when we go to install the camera. Alright, and then you get your arm screws, standoffs, cone washers, standoff screws, and also motor screws. So these M3x8 motor screws are going to be pretty much essential when you have 5mm thick arms, because the motor screws that typically come with motors are M3x6 or M3x7. They're accounting for 4mm of arm thickness, so when you're using 5mm, it helps to have that little bit of extra thickness. And it also comes with the lipo pad for the top plate, so that when you mount your battery there, it's not directly pressing on the top of the button head screws. It gives a little padding, also a little grip, so when you crash it doesn't just slide directly out the back. It comes with 2 straps. These are metal buckle and also Kevlar weave straps, and they have a silicone backing, so they're nice and robust. They don't break super easy, they don't let your battery slide out or anything like that. So also save those things for later when we go to put the top plate on. Okay, so one thing to point out really quick is that you'll see me using, these are actually 4mm arms that I have here. The production version is actually going to come with 5mm thick 6-inch arms. So these are just kind of they were actually made by accident, so I'm just using them up. Alright, so to start off the build, you're just going to want to grab the arm screws and the purple cone washers that go on the bottom. Grab your bottom plate, your brace plate, and one arm to start off with. And the way this assembles is that these arm screws push through the cone washer, and that's how they mount up through the brace plate on the bottom. So what you want to do is just push one through there, and then put the arm over there. And that should go to the center. Make sure you're using the outer screw hole on the arm so that they all line up in the center. Also make sure that this channel is facing up. This will allow you to do arm swaps super quickly, because the arm can just slide over the button head screw that'll sit there for the stack. So you don't have to mess with your stack screws, you don't have to mess with your standoff screws, anything like that. You just remove the 2 arm bolts, and then this arm will slide right out. So yeah, just make sure that's facing up away from the brace plate on the bottom. And then grab the bottom plate, line it up with the press nut in there. And then grab a 2.5mm driver and just get a loose fit on there. Okay, so now that you have one arm in, you just repeat the process for all 4 arms. Again, making sure that the channel is facing up each time. Actually, if you get the first one in the right way, it's impossible to put the rest of them in the wrong way, so that's kind of a bonus. Okay, so I've just got the outer 4 screws in here for now. I'm going to leave it that way. I'm going to do the build this way. I'm going to have to come back with Loctite and make sure that those are all locked into place. Also, another thing to note really quick is that if you install all of these, if you install these center 4, these cone washers that came with the production version of the Dilly just barely overlap this screw hole. The older ones were a little bit thinner on the bottom, so they didn't have that issue. But if you try to put, okay, so some button head screws will work, but I've had some where when I screw this into place and then I try to put the stack screw in there, it doesn't work. So just be cautious of that. I'm looking to get that fixed. I'm looking to get the old ones back and put into the kits. But for now, that is an issue you just want to be aware of. So some stack screws may not fit in there with the cone washers in the centers. Also, if you have one in there, and even if it's a captive button head in there, you can still get in there with a driver to like loosen or tighten the screw. If you have it in there, it's just a matter of, you'll have to loosen these up or take them off to get that screw in and out. But once it's in there, it's fine. So yeah, like I said, I'm going to be leaving those off for now. We can put those to the side. And so from here is where the fun begins. So now I'm going to start assembling the actual internals of the quad, starting with the flight controller. Okay, so this is a CLF4. It's the FC we're going to be using. Like I said, it has dedicated power pads for the ESCs, which makes it really nice for a build like this with all individual ESCs rather than a 4-in-1, although it also has a 4-in-1 plug if that's, you know, the way you want to rock it. The only drawback to this flight controller really is that the LiPo pads are on the underside. I would really like these to be on the top side somewhere, maybe over here, move these components around, but for now we're stuck with the LiPo leads on the underside of the flight controller. Also on the underside you have an SD slot if you want to do any black box logging. This is also a really nice flight controller just in terms of the layout of everything. So you have VTX, power, and signal back here. You also have TX and RX4, 5-volt and ground. That's typically where I wire in my NanoRx. And then up here you have the camera pads. So camera control, camera power, camera signal, of course, all that stuff is up front. So when you have the camera up here and the VTX back here, everything looks really neat. You know, you wire the VTX directly to these pads, you wire the camera directly to these pads, and then the ESCs just go out from the center. So it makes for a really clean build. I just really like the way this is laid out. So the very first thing I'm going to do with this flight controller is to wire up the XT60 lead coming out the back, the LiPo lead. And while I'm back there, I'm also going to wire the capacitor in. So I like to have the capacitor coming directly off these LiPo leads. It's just easiest to do it while I'm there, rather than you know, getting the build done and then having to flip everything over and try to do stuff retroactively on the back. Just get it all out of the way, do it all at once. So this is the wire I'm going to be using for my XT60 lead. This is just, I believe, 14 gauge silicone wire. And to cut these to length, I'm just going to kind of lay this in here and get a sense of what the lengths are that I'm going to need. And I'm going to be running this LiPo lead out the side and up to the top plate. I figure I'll slice it about there. Okay, and I'm going to use some blue tack to hold these wires in place while I tin them. This stuff is super cheap and super convenient to use. I'd highly recommend getting some if you don't have some already. What it's also really good for is getting iron shavings or just anything that's stuck in your motor unstuck from your motor. So especially in bandos and stuff, when you got iron shavings, they really like to stick directly to the magnets in your motors, which seizes them up and causes them not to work. And what you can do with this stuff is just take your motor bell off and stick it around in there and get all the gunk stuck to it, and then rip it out, and then your motor is good as new. Okay, and now to tin the XT60. Now the only other thing is make sure that the positive goes to the blue, or you may use red, and that the negative goes to the black. Just this is really important. If you screw up the orientation on this, it's very likely you'll fry something, if not everything, that's connected to your flight controller. So just double, triple, quadruple check this. Make sure you've got this the right way. So the positive is going to go on the flat, kind of cornered end of the XT60, and the negative is the one that is rounded. Usually they're marked right on the connector, so it's kind of hard to screw up, but wouldn't be the first time. I'm going to wait a sec for this to cool down a little bit, but once it does, I'm going to apply some conformal coating to each of these. This may be like way overkill, but better safe than sorry. If any moisture gets between these two, the LiPo is just going to directly short, and then that's bad news. There we go, and that should snap in, and the XT60 is done. You can buy something like this pre-wired up. I wouldn't really recommend it. It doesn't take that long, and also you're going to have to solder this end anyways, so you're going to have to learn how to solder these big 14 or 12 gauge wires one way or another. And if you just buy the wire and buy the connectors, you can make like 6 for the price of, you know, what one pre-made one would cost. So you may notice this is bridging to the shunt resistor, and that's actually fine. That's the positive side of the shunt resistor anyway. That has total continuity to the positive side regardless, so shorting it doesn't really do anything. Okay, so the XT60 is connected up to the bottom there. So the next thing to do is to get the capacitor connected up. So like I said, this is a 1000 microfarad 35 volt capacitor. This is a Panasonic, makes this one. Just make sure if you're getting one, you're getting a low ESR capacitor. Because if you get a capacitor with high ESR, it may actually have the opposite effect of a low ESR capacitor and actually make your build more noisy. The negative leg of this capacitor is denoted by this strip here on the side. And I'm just going to make a little tiny, I don't even know what you would call it in the capacitor. I hope you can see it there. It just makes it a little more easy to directly solder wires to it rather than trying to solder a wire to a pin leg, essentially. If you just make a loop, it will give wider area for the solder to stick to and for the wire to go in. Alright, there we go. We've got a good solid connection on each leg there. So what I'm going to do just to make this more, a little more solid, more durable, because these legs do tend to, if they bend, they will break right off. They just snap. So I'm going to do 2 things. One of them is heat shrink. Stiff purple heat shrink. This is PVC heat shrink. Just enough length so that the bottom will kind of cover those leads. Alright, and the other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to put some hot glue in and around this area. That will just, again, help this to stay in place so that those legs don't keep bending around and breaking. You can use a lighter to do this, but I like to use a heat gun just because I have one and it makes it easier, more evenly distributes the heat, it's way quicker, just better to use overall. And once you've done that, that cap is going to be really solid. And since these XT60 pads are so bulky and really just annoying to work with, it really helps to get these tinned super well before you even try to put them onto the FC. Alright, so now that that is all done up, I'm going to do the same thing again as I did to the XT60 and just take some conformal coating and put it over here. And actually, while I'm on the bottom, I'm just going to go ahead and conformal coat the entire bottom of the FC. Just because that makes it much more waterproof and, as I was saying before, much more robust. But I am going to focus on these leads because they are the most, I guess you would say, protuberant thing on the back of this thing, and they're the most dangerous for sure, because as I keep saying, you really do not want to short out your LiPo lead, because stuff will explode. And then as far as conformal coating the board goes, you know, you just want to get a nice even coat, and make sure that all these surface mount components are covered. And actually, if you've got a black light handy, you can check your coverage with a black light, because this stuff will glow under black light, and the spots where you're not covered will not glow. So it's a nice, easy way to check your work. You don't want to get inside the SD card slot. I mean, I guess if you are sure that you never want to use an SD card, you can go in there with conformal coating. But you don't want to get like inside there, just because it'll gum up the connections and make it all sticky and pretty much unusable. So try not to do that. Okay, I'm going to set that aside, and while we are waiting for that to dry up, grab the frame again. We are going to want to put our stack screws in, because the stack is the next thing that has to go in. So like I said earlier, I'm going to be mounting my NanoRx and my stack to this little half board thing. So I'm actually going to use two different lengths of standoffs. I'm going to use longer ones in the front and shorter ones in the back. So in order to measure up my stack, I will put a screw through there like that, and then I'll basically assemble my stack, but like only one corner of it. So in place of the FC, I just put the FC gummy to get the spacing. But I'll start off with a spacer. Oh, whoops. So I found some stack screws that have links that are going to work for me here. So just to keep those in there, I'll keep that upside down. And the next thing to do is really quickly pop the gummies into the FC so we can actually put it in the stack. Now the CLF4S comes with these yellow ones, these bright yellow gummies, but they're not purple. There, these are much better. Another thing that tweezers will help you with is getting these gummies shoved in, because without some sort of sharp end, they are impossible to fit in. But you can poke these through fairly easily if you get a grip on them, and then yank them through the top. Okay, so now that that painstaking process is over, we can actually put the stack together. Okay, so note that the side with the camera stuff, ESC4 and ESC2, this side right here is intended to be for the front. So up until this point, the build is symmetric on each side, so the bottom plate doesn't need to be oriented front to back. But once you put the FC on, your build will have some sort of directionality that you'll need to continue to follow for the rest of the build. So keeping that in mind, I'm making sure that the longer standoff screws are on this side because I want my NanoRx up towards the front. And you're probably just going to have to come back here and pop these all the way back through. Once you get them through with the FC in there, the gummies should kind of hold them in place. Just another really quick thing to note, this cap is going to be mounted in between the standoffs here via this little 3D printed mount. I don't have these for sale in the store, but they are readily available on Thingiverse if you want to just download them and print them, or have someone print them for you, or whatever. So it's going to look something like that, and then I'll just keep it up and out of the way of anything. Yeah, that's how I like to mount them. Alright, so the next step of the build is to wire the ESCs onto the flight controller, but there's a couple things I like to do to the ESCs before even getting started with them. I totally get rid of this PVC wire that comes on here, the signal and ground wires, and I rewire in with this silicone wire. So this is the heat shrink that I like to use for the ESCs. As you can see, it's way, way bigger than the stock heat shrink that comes with it, which in my opinion is better because when it shrinks down more, it actually gets thicker, and it's actually already thicker heat shrink to begin with. So this stuff gives it a nice thick protective layer so that it can take damage from prop strikes or, you know, just general crashing or whatever, and it's not an issue. So again, I'm just going to go along and desolder the stock signal and ground wires. So I go over the ground pad again, but I don't use signal grounds on my ESCs, mostly just because of the fact that the CLF4 doesn't have dedicated signal grounds for the ESC inputs, so it kind of defeats the purpose to go directly from the signal ground to the ESC ground because they're already continuous there. You're not really doing anything by doing that, or I don't know, maybe somebody will tell me I am an idiot and totally wrong about that, but yeah, in my opinion, I haven't used signal grounds on ESCs in a long time, and I can't think of a scenario where I found that to be the cause of any issue that I've had. So, I don't put them on there anymore. Okay, and just like the flight controller, since that's the last thing I have to do on the bottom side of the PCB, I'm just going to go ahead with my conformal coating. And we can set those aside to dry for just a second. Now, coming back to the frame, what we're going to want to do is take some of this stuff and put it on each of the arms where the ESCs are going to be mounted. That way we can get an idea for where the ESC is going to go, and therefore how much spacing we need between the wire and the FC, so we can cut those wires to length. Alright, the next thing we can do while we're waiting for the conformal coat on the ESCs to dry is to tin all the ESC pads that we're going to need, which include the power, ground, and signal for each one. So now what I typically do here is I just stick them right on there, and we're going to put heat shrink over them before we stick them on there permanently, but just for getting the spacing of everything, I like to stick it right on there just for now. And then I can go through and cut all my wires to length. Okay, one thing I want to point out really quick that I forgot to mention before is that you do want to either leave enough slack in these ESC wires that the standoffs can fit in around them, or put the standoffs in first so that you can work around them so that you know for sure that they're not going to interfere at all. Alright, so the next step is going to be to put on the motors, but before we do that, remember to put these on. And like I showed earlier, they just kind of slide over the arm ends. They stretch a little bit, so you can stretch them just enough to kind of get them over. And like I said earlier, these are Brother Hobby 2208 2400 kV. They are nice, cool purple because they're custom Buffalo motor, going with the theme of color coordination here. And again, these screws that come with them are just a little too short. You can almost tell just by looking at them that they're shorter than the motor screws that come with the Dilly. So at this point, I'm going to go ahead and Loctite everything that needs to be Loctited. So that will include all 16 motor screws, the 8 bottom standoff screws, and also the 8 arm screws. So pretty much everything that attaches to the bottom, as a rule of thumb, should have blue Loctite on it, with the exception just of the stack screws because they're screwed into nylon. And for the Loctite itself, I am just using one of the bags left over from the hardware. I'm just going to put enough on there to get a good amount, but also make sure it doesn't run over the side. And when you are doing this, you really don't want to overdo the Loctite. It gets messy quick. Just a little bit on the end will go a long way. One down, 31 to go. Alright, so the motors are on, the standoffs are on, the arm screws are in, and all of those things have Loctite, so I think that's most of the tedious parts of the build really are done now. It'll seem to go a lot quicker from here. Yeah, I guess the next thing to do is to wire up these motors to the ESCs. So one thing to note really quick is that, again, these are Heli 32 ESCs, and you can program them with a Windows computer or tablet or whatever. A workaround, if for some case you don't have access to a Windows computer, to reverse the motor direction, you can swap any two wires. So rather than wiring them in the same way, you can swap the middle one with the right one, or the right one with the left one, or whatever you want to do. Swapping any two will change the direction that the motor spins. But the way I'm going to set mine up is that I'm just going to wire them all straight in, and then I'm going to go into Heli 32 configurator later and just reverse the motors that need to be reversed. I think it makes for a cleaner looking build. Alright, now, like I said, I'm just going to cut some lengths of heat shrink to put over the ESCs. Now, so this is a bit of a tricky part, that you want to solder these motor wires up and conformal coat the top half of the ESC, but you also got to put the heat shrink over the top and wait for the stuff to dry before you shrink it. So I think I've got enough space on this build, yeah, because these arms are a little bit longer. I'm going to be able to put the heat shrink on there, slide it to this end, and then I can do the conformal coating and then slide it back over. But it may be trickier for the 5-inch arms. Alright, so now just remembering to put the ESC heat shrink over the wires first. I'm going to solder up all these motor wires. Alright, and before I go ahead and conformal coat the top half of these ESCs, one thing I really like to do, and I learned this from Frank Sarfino, is I just get a little container. This has isopropyl alcohol in it, and I just dip a toothbrush in there and just kind of wipe away at these joints. And what that's going to do is it's going to clean off any remaining flux that's on the board. I don't know, for some reason, especially the motor wires and the ESCs tend to get a lot of flux built up on the end, so I just like to clean them up when I'm done. I do the same thing for the FC when I'm done with everything on there before I conformal coat the top half of that too, so you see me do it there as well. Okay, and since it's isopropyl alcohol, it evaporates and dries very quickly, so you're not going to have to wait very long before you can apply the conformal coat. And since the GS35s have this big metal shroud on top, it's not really necessary to go like over the top with conformal coating, but I do like to get in the sides just to make sure that, just in case any moisture gets in the sides, it's not going to mess with anything. Alright, so those are all coated. I think the next thing I'm going to do is wire in the VTX. And in addition to just the actual tramp, I'm going to wire in the tag that goes on the backside. So that way I have access to change my channels, my band, my power, whatever. Alright, so just looking at the way that this is going to go in, I'm going to have to wire this in kind of upside down, or I guess backwards, depending on how you look at it, from the way I would normally mount it. So normally I'd use tiny Axii antennas that has a direct UFL connection to the VTX. and that just slides over the back standoffs, and the VTX sits in there just like that, with the headers facing that way. But in this case, the way I'm going to mount the antenna, because I want a full-size antenna, since this is a 6-inch and may want to do some more mid-range or maybe even long-range stuff. So the way it's going to mount is these little holes on the top plate are meant to hold an SMA antenna in place with zip ties, but I can't do that with it this way, so I just am going to have to turn it around and do it that way so that it reaches up like that. Actually, the heat shrink that comes on the Tramp is it's the kind of hard stuff. It's a little bit thin. I don't really like the heat shrink that comes with it, so I usually go ahead and chop this right off straight out of the box. And I used the same heat shrink for the ESCs for the Tramp. And that's just going to give it, again, a little bit extra outer shell, I guess if you want to call it that. But again, before I do that, I am going to run some conformal coating over this. And typically I just do the pin connectors here on this side, and then I do everything on this side. Alright, now set that off to the side and let it dry. In the meantime, we are going to take the header for the Tramp and wire it up into the FC. So depending on what you need, you may need to remove different wires from the header. Like for example, if you want audio, you're just going to keep that wire and wire it up to wherever. I'm going to remove audio. I never fly with audio. T is for telemetry. That is if you want to connect the VTX to the flight controller and have it change band channel power through OSD rather than doing it through the wand. Again, I just used the wand, so I'm going to go ahead and remove that wire. Video you want to keep because that's the video signal. This 5-volt thing right here is actually an output, not an input. And that is for... So with this VTX, and you can kind of see it better on this harness, you can actually take the 5-volt out and the ground and wire your camera directly from it, power your camera directly from it, and then the video feeds directly into the VTX. But since I am going to be using the Betaflight OSD, I'm going to have to wire the video basically passing through the flight controller rather than directly from the camera to the VTX. So the video goes from the camera that produces the image to the flight controller that overlays the on-screen display. It gives me stuff like voltage, current drawn, timers, all that sort of thing. And then it spits it out to the VTX that then transmits it directly to the goggles. For this particular build, we are only going to need to keep the red wire, the black wire, and the yellow wire, not to be confused with the orange one that's for output voltage. So many people, when they don't need the wires, just choose to snip them really short at the harness. But what I like to do instead, because it's a little more robust, a little safer, is to actually just take and de-pin all of the pins that we don't need. So all you gotta do is get in there with something sharp, something small, lift that little plastic part up, and then the corresponding wire should pop right out. So now we have input power, ground, and video input. So since, like I said, the VTX is going to be kind of backwards in here, I'm going to need a bit more space to do this properly. I'm going to need a bit more wire length. Alright, so it's going to end up about here. Typically you want to keep these short to reduce the noise that's going to be in the video line. But in this case, I don't really have too much of a choice. I don't think it'll be an issue. Okay, and that's actually all the wiring that needs to be done for the VTX. Oh, actually, before I go any further, I'm going to shrink the heat shrink for the ESCs. Okay, now I'm just sticking these back in place, and I'm going to grab some electrical tape and wrap it around there to permanently secure the ESCs to the arms. Alright, now that the VTX is dry, I'm just going to go ahead and apply some heat shrink to that as well. Alright, some people may think that this is kind of overkill for going over the VTX, because it is going to get hot. But personally, with the Tramp, I've never had an issue with overheating. The longevity of these things is really unmatched in terms of like anything I've used or heard of anybody using. Pretty much everyone in this area uses these, and we have virtually no issues with interfering, with a couple exceptions if we're being extremely dumb. But, you know, we can have 4 people in the air, race band 2, 4, 6, and 8 on 600 milliwatts. And I've been running mine for probably, the one in my quad now, I've been running it for probably 6 to 8 months. And that's been my only quad that I've been flying. And I probably fly an average of 25 to 35 packs a week. So they do last. They last, and I've always conformal coated and used this heat shrink on VTXs, so can't argue with results. Okay, and then I'm just going to take some more of this 3M double-sided adhesive foam, and I'm actually going to, what I do with these is because they're a little, they have this header on the edge, and I like to mount them flat side down like this. I do one strip for here over, and then one strip for the full length, just so that it sits flat, and this header isn't bashing straight up against carbon every time it takes a hit. Alright, so now that that foam is applied, I am just going to stick it right on there. And if you notice on the Dilly, these holes are pretty much perfectly wide enough to fit a Tramp right in between, so you can zip tie it down really securely. Actually, I am going to move this back just a tiny bit, just because I don't want the connectors sticking out the end. Alright, and then the other thing you're going to want to wire in is the wand wire. Oh, really quick, actually. What I'm going to do with this is take this heat shrink off and reapply some purple stuff. Alright, now that that's all matchy-matchy, we can put it on the quad. And this is kind of tricky because this is going to sit right here. This header needs to pass through one of these side holes. It's kind of a tight fit through there. Before I put that there though, again, I am going to apply just a tiny bit of this stuff on there. And then this whole center connector part should slide right down into that center hole in the bottom plate, so it should fit nice and flush. Okay, so now the only thing left to do for the VTX is to just put some zip ties around it. So one zip tie would probably work, but I just go ahead and use both of them. Okay, that doesn't look so bad. Alright, so that does it for the VTX. So pretty much the only things to do from here is to wire up the camera and to wire in the NanoRx, and then that pretty much completes the hardware side of the build. So I'm going to start with the camera. Like I said, this is the JB version of the RunCam Micro Eagle. This is definitely my favorite FPV camera that I've used. Okay, so you get a bunch of extra goodies with this camera. Plenty of hardware and screws and whatnot. But anyways, the two things you're gonna need out of here are this connector and that connector. This one for the camera control, this one for ground power and video signal. And then yet again, I am going to put conformal coating on this. Micro eagles are actually very sensitive to moisture. They are pretty much the first thing to go when you're flying in snowy or super wet areas. So I take that back cover right off and just put it on there. Alright, I'll set that aside to let it dry. And now, in the meantime, I am just going to cut these to length, tin them, and solder them to the board. So I usually give these a little bit of extra length just because, just in case you want to like change your camera angle or anything. It sucks when you cut them a little too short and then, you know, you can't move it around. So one thing I do, because there's only one ground wire over here on this side of the flight controller. There is this one all the way over here, but just for the sake of convenience, I twist the ground wire from the camera control and this other harness. I twist them together just so that it's easier to wire them both to the same pad on the FC. So yeah, I just twist them together before I tin them, so that way once they're tinned, they are totally locked together. Alright, that should do it for everything going to the camera. Now again, I'm just going to brush off the flight controller just to get any excess flux off or any physical debris that may have somehow ended up there through the course of the build. Alright, so my plan was to mount the cap back here in this printed part, just put it right here between the standoffs, but I realized that there's no way I can do that without it interfering with this SMA connector that's going to connect to the top plate here. So I think what I'm going to do instead is take this, which I typically mount my NanoRx to, put it up here, mount the cap here, and then just take the NanoRx and put it down here behind the camera. Just kind of a change of plans here, but no big deal. So with that being said, I think I'm actually going to go ahead and mount my NanoRx now, so that it isn't impossible to get back there once everything else is in. Alright, and I'm pretty sure the old NanoRxs used to have the pads labeled on the board, but looks like this one doesn't, so I don't know if they stopped doing that or if I am just crazy and imagining things. Ground 5-volt RX-TX. Alright, and then again, as per the standard procedure, I'm just going to give this a little bit of conformal coating. So you want to make sure when you're conformal coating something like this where it has an antenna connector, also if you're conformal coating the Tramp with the connector off, you definitely want to make sure that you don't get conformal coat inside this connector for the antenna, because it'll really mess up your signal strength, and that's definitely not something you want with your control link. So before I go any further, I'm actually just going to let this dry. Like I said, I don't want to really do much before I get this installed because it's going to kind of be underneath everything here. So I don't want to put the cap on first because it's going to cover up, and I need to run wires back here to wire this up, and I don't want to put the camera in because it's going to be right over top of there. So I'm just going to have to wait a couple minutes for that to dry before I proceed. One thing I am going to do while I wait though is actually just going to screw this antenna on, and I'm going to put some heat shrink over the whole connection. So I'm just going to, after I connect this down, I am going to put some hard heat shrink over the whole connection. And that's just so that this doesn't start to like unscrew or anything like that, because as this sits on here, if this twists, if this gets hit, and you have to kind of like bend this back, it's kind of a common occurrence for that to eventually come loose. And once that starts to come loose, your video signal really starts to degrade real quick, and that is definitely not optimal. Alright, that looks pretty good. So then that's not going to be twisting around or doing anything nefarious like that. So I guess what I'm going to do now, while I'm still waiting for those couple things to dry, the camera and the NanoRx, I'm going to apply this lipo pad to the top plate, just because I'm going to have to zip tie that thing onto the top plate, the SMA connection, here pretty soon. So this is real straightforward, just works like a sticker. Just peel the back off, stick it to the top plate, and you are good to go. And this doesn't have to be exactly lined up, but it does have to be sort of close. If it's off way too much, then it will overlap with the screw holes that are here, and you won't be able to screw your screws down all the way into the standoffs, and that's no good. So just make sure it's nearly where it's supposed to be, and you should be good to go. The other thing to mention about this is that it really butts up against the GoPro mount if you leave it at its full length. So what I like to do is just take it right about here and just cut it off, take this piece off, and then I don't have to worry about it butting up against there. I wanted to keep this little strip here just in case, you know, maybe somebody's not running the GoPro mount and slides their battery up a little further. It's nice to have that little extra spot. It's not really that much work to just chop it. Okay, so now the GoPro mount has plenty of clearance there, and it won't interfere at all. Alright, now since I should be able to just put this top plate right off to the side as I finish the build, I'm going to go ahead and attach the antenna on here now. So just 2 zip ties will do it. And you want to have this part, this fat end, I don't know what this is called, you want to have this on the bottom side of the top plate, because if you have it on the top side, it's going to stick out and poke into your battery. And it'll fit on there just like that. Alright, so at this point the NanoRx is pretty much dry. So what I'm going to do is put the antenna back on it. And, of course, put a heat shrink over it. Alright, so typically I would turn this antenna 180 degrees like this and then heat shrink over it. But I think just that little bit of extra length that doing it this way is going to give me, I'm actually going to need. And so now I just have to wire it up. So 5-volt and ground, as you'd expect. And then I have my white wire set to go to RX and yellow to TX. Well, I'm starting to think maybe I should have done it the way I usually do it, where I put the Mortal T at a 180, because it'll have a better... because this is going to have to bend way back now, actually. Whereas if I just twist it, it's going to bend right into place. Maybe it's worth it. I think I'm gonna do it. Alright, some more double-sided adhesive foam to mount it to the bottom plate. Alright, so that is the NanoRx. It's totally installed, should be totally good to go. And lastly, I guess, is the eagle to put in the camera. So I'm just going to stick this adhesive thing back on, this cover on the back. Oh yeah, and the Immortal T can push right through the top plate, so there's no need to worry about that. It just pushes right through there, nice and easy. Okay, so this is the hardware for the camera. And here's the FPV cam mounts that come with the Dilly. And I think there's a couple different lengths of screws in here, so I'm going to choose the longest ones. Because we are going to be, yep, these are the longest ones. So we're going to be using washers in addition to going through the cam mount. So I definitely highly recommend using these washers because they will greatly increase the surface area that this bolt has to grip onto the TPU. Without it, the tiny bolt head is extremely likely to just pretty much rip straight through the TPU as soon as you have a hard crash or anything like that. So yeah, I definitely put these washers on. Right there. Good. All right. All right. It looks like the camera comes pretty close to touching the NanoRx on the bottom there, but I think that's going to be no problem at all. And so the last thing to do is to just put the cap in place. Alright, once again, a couple zip ties will do us. I think we're good to put the top plate on and do a couple basic checks and plug it in and see if she runs. Looks good. I don't know what the angle is like on that, but looks like a pretty clean build. Looks like there's going to be a lot of airspace in there for airflow and such. Yeah. Oh, one thing I want to do before I screw on the top plate is to put the battery straps in. This is kind of tough when the top plate is installed. You kind of have to weave them through there. Alright, one thing you want to remember when you're doing this is you don't want to over tighten the bolts that go into your GoPro mount, or any TPU for that matter. If they're like really squished down, like if I really cinch this down and it looks like this where it's like all squished up around the bolt, that's too far. You need to back that off. Basically a rule of thumb is once it starts to feel like harder from screwing into the TPU, give it like 2 more turns and then let it sit there. This isn't going to back out. You don't need it to be as tight as other bolts, like such as these top plate bolts, because since they're screwed into TPU, like they're not going to vibrate out. That basically like grips them right in there. So and if you over tighten them, the TPU gets really thin where the mount meets the top plate, and then they have a tendency to just rip apart. So you definitely don't want to over tighten those, because it will rip your GoPro mount. And all my GoPro mounts have this little Immortal T holder on the back. That's just how I prefer to mount my antennas. It's really good. It's away from carbon. It's out of the way. It tends to really not get damaged there, surprisingly. You'd think it would, but they usually last pretty much forever on there. Other than that, I think that pretty much wraps up the hardware side of the build. Should in theory be good to plug in and go right now. But I'm going to do one quick thing. This, by the way, is a multimeter. If you don't know what this is, or if you don't have one, you definitely need to get one. If something is going wrong with your quad, or for any basic troubleshooting, really, you're going to need some kind of multimeter. Check for continuity, check for voltage, if you're getting correct voltage on certain lines. So right now this is set to check for continuity. So basically, if I touch these together, it will beep because there's continuity between the probes. So if I do something like this as well, hear them beep because there's continuity, because this is connected. So what we don't want is a short on the XT60 lead. So we just put these right on here, and the positive and negative doesn't matter here. You'll hear it beep for a second in the beginning, and that's because the capacitor on the LiPo lead acts as a short really quick until it charges up and has that voltage to maintain. So you'll hear it go real quick, and that's the capacitor, and then if you don't hear it at all after that, you are pretty much good to go. That means there's no shorts. on your VBAT pads. That's not to say that there's not a short on maybe some of the 5-volt pads, but that's just a general check. But yeah, there it is. So I'm confident. Let's grab a battery and let's plug it in, see if she turns on. Moment of truth. Alright, so the first 3 beeps indicated that the ESCs had power and they're all good. And then the final 2 indicate that the flight controller is good and is communicating with the ESCs. And if you hear the beeps, that pretty much by definition means the motors are functioning, because the only reason you actually hear beeps is because the motors are vibrating at a certain frequency and creating those noises. So in practical terms, that means if you don't have a motor connected to your ESC, you won't hear the startup tones, because there's actually no speaker on the ESC. It's making that noise through the motor. So just be aware of that. Some people get nervous when they plug up ESCs and they don't make a noise, but it's just because they don't have a motor connected. But anyways, other than that, yeah, let's just head over to the software side. We're going to have to plug up to Betaflight to make sure that our receiver is working, and BL Heli for motor direction. But in terms of the hardware assembly, everything looks like it's good to go.